Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you might be viewing this recording. I'm Rachel Brook with K-State Research and Extension in the Phillips Brooks District, Ag and 4-H agent. And joining me is Keith Harmoney, range specialist with the Agriculture Research Center out of Hayes. And our spring this year, as most of you know, was cool and dry. And so we're going to be talking about some drought management things and how you can manage your range and your stocking rates of your cattle or your cow-calf operation. So with that, Keith, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and we'll begin your presentation this morning.
Okay, well, thank you, Rachel. And I just have a few slides to go over with you this morning that talk about, well, our current conditions as far as how much precipitation we've had so far this year and trying to predict how much forage we're going to have this year based on the amount of precipitation that we receive. And so that's about what I'm going to be talking with you this morning on. And a few key points that I want folks to keep in mind as I go through this presentation is that drought is common. Okay, May and June precipitation are good predictors of pasture yield at the end of the season, and calculating stocking rates are critical to animal production and also pasture production out in the pasture. So those are a few main points that I want folks to take from listening to this this video. And so out here in Western Kansas, we're usually either in a drought or recovering from a drought. And we have drought conditions 1 out of every 5 years. And that's based on annual precipitation being 75% or less of our average precipitation. So having a drought is rather common. So 20% of the time we have a drought year in Western Kansas. And we have what's called a flash drought or a short drought, or a short-term drought 1 out of every 6 years, less than 6 years out here in Western Kansas for the months of April, May, and June. And I point out April, May, and June because those are the months that are going to be most critical for our forage production through the year. And so those months are pretty important, and the occurrence of drought during that time is very important to us. And the production that we have out in our pastures is highly related to how much precipitation we receive on an annual water year basis. And that annual water year goes from October of the prior year through September of the current growing season. So the water year would have been October of 2021 through this coming September of 2022. And that's the annual water year that I'm talking about. And so how much forage we receive or how much forage we produce during that time period is highly dependent on and correlated with that precipitation. But for us to calculate stocking rates and to be able to manage pastures, we can't wait all the way through the end of the 2022 growing season, September, to make decisions. We have to do those earlier. And so based on some information that we have here at our research center in Hayes, from decades of looking at weather and precipitation and pasture production and animal production and linking all those together, we found that May and June precipitation is a very good predictor of how much forage yield we're going to have in our pastures here at the research center at the end of the growing season. And having that as a good predictor is important because by the end of that June time period, we can determine how much forage we can expect to have at the end of the year. So if we need to make a management decision, we can do that before the midpoint of the growing season, and we can make adjustments. And when we have years of drought, or looks like we may be going to be having a year of moderate to extreme drought, this time period could be a good trigger point for us to go in and destock some of our pastures and better balance the amount of forage that's produced with the amount of forage demand that those animals are going to be grazing during the season. So from this slide here, what this is showing us is that when we have below average precipitation, which our average in May and June is just over 6 inches. When we have below average precipitation, we have a very good relationship between the amount of precip we get and our forage yield. And I don't know if you can see the cursor on the screen here, but it shows me that when we have about 30% of our average rainfall in May and June, that we get just about 50% of our forage production for the year. When we get about 2/3 of our precipitation in May and June, we get about 70 to 75% of our forage produced for the year. So using this relationship, we're able to better balance our forage that we expect to grow and the animal demand that we have out there on our pastures. So how much grass will we have in other parts of the state? You know, that relationship was for our haze pastures, but it's probably going to be similar for other locations as well. So like out here in Scott County, when we look at the rangeland growth curve, by the end of June, we usually have about 60% of the forage produced already at that time. So by the end of that June time period, more than half of the forage that's going to be produced for the year should have been already out there in the pasture. But when we have a lack of rainfall during that early springtime, we're going to have reduced growth during that springtime too, when those plants and those pastures are needing that moisture to put on dry matter and producing that forage that our animals are going to consume during the whole growing season. So that May-June time period and that precipitation level can be a good trigger point for us to determine whether or not we're going to have enough forage out there through the whole season for the stocking rate that we have stocked to start the season. So calculating that stocking rate is one of the most important steps in range management that we have, because that stocking rate balances the amount of forage we have available with our animal requirement. And so if we are constantly overstocked, we're going to reduce the vigor of those plants, and we're also going to lower our animal production long term. Now we can make adjustments during the growing season based on the precipitation that we receive in May and June. So we can start out with a stocking rate that we expect will be a sustainable one. But if we know that we're going to be in a drought situation, or we see that by the end of June that we're going to be lacking forage, we can adjust and we can reduce that stocking rate so we don't put more stress on those forage plants by the end of the year. Now, when we talk about drought, one of the things that we also need to look at is the potential for plant toxicity. Because when we have a drought situation, when we don't have moisture, our main grasses that we have out there in our pastures may have time periods when they'll go dormant. Like this picture here, this was taken in 2006 in a pasture between Dighton and Jetmore. And at this time of the year, this pasture should be green and growing. But in 2006, we were really dry. And basically all our grasses went dormant. But you can see a few plants out there that are still green. And those plants that are still green may be more attractive to animals that would be out there on pasture. And if those plants are toxic, animals are going to be tempted to graze on those. And so that's why during drought years, when plants stay green longer and maybe we have less forage out there for them to eat to get enough fill, they may tend to graze on some more toxic plants. So here's some that are potentially toxic plants that are found in most all rangeland pastures out in the western part of the state. Woolly loco, Lambert's crazy weed, some milkweeds, choke cherry can also be toxic, poison hemlock, eastern black nightshade, and elderberry. All those are potentially toxic. Usually animals don't graze on those. They're found in most every pasture. At least some of those are found in most every rangeland pasture. But animals usually have enough other things to consume that they don't graze on these poisonous plants. And another set that are sometimes toxic, broom snakeweed, some ground cells, cutleaf iron plant, on down the list. Again, these are plants that animals usually are not going to graze on during a typical year when we have enough moisture. It's just that during time periods of drought, they may be more tempted to graze on these. And when we do have periods of drought and our grass is stressed, we may not have as dense of a grass stand out in our pastures. It's going to lack some vigor from lacking rain. And if we do not do anything to reduce stalking rates, those plants could be defoliated more than what they should be. And so they'll lose some vigor from that. And so that opens up an area for other plants to come in and to have an advantage over those, or to take the opportunity to grow from a lack of vigor. And so some things that we may see are some annual invaders that may come in, like kochia, some lamb's quarter, sunflowers, foxtails, pigweeds. All those plants may be transient plants that will come in and grow during this lower time of vigor of our main grass plants. Now, one good thing about these is that a lot of these are very palatable and can be highly nutritious, but we also have to be aware that they also could have nitrates in them or accumulate nitrate if they are growing during a drought period and are lacking some growth. So they could be nitrate accumulators or have nitrate in them. So we do have to be aware of that. So in the end, generally, the prior year condition or the vigor of our pastures in the year before a drought, and the amount of precipitation that we get through the winter, those are two things that set us up for how much forage production potential we have that next growing season. But the current year rainfall is the main determinant of how much forage we're going to have at the end of the growing season. And using that May and June time period as a predictor works very well for us to be able to predict how much forage we're going to have at the end of the growing season.
And Keith, you mentioned that you have a grazing stick as well that you can use in grazing management.
Yeah, I do have a grazing stick with me. For folks that are wondering how much forage they do have available out in a pasture, and to try to do some stalking rate calculations, we do have what's called a grazing stick. Basically, it's a ruler with inch mark increments on it. And essentially what you do with this is you walk an area in your pasture that you're wanting to sample, you place the stick into the forage canopy, and you measure to what height you have basically leaf tissue, where you first reach leaf tissue on the grazing stick. And you record several locations of that. You come up with an average height for your pasture. And then there's a little table on this grazing stick that states how many pounds of forage per inch of height you would expect for the region where that pasture is located in. It has a table broken down into tall grass prairie, mixed grass prairie, and short grass prairie, and also for low plant density, medium plant density, and high plant density. And so using this table, I don't know if you're able to see this or not.
We can see some of it, yes.
But using this table, it allows you to be able to calculate how many pounds of forage per inch of height your rangeland is producing. And that's one way that you can come up with an estimate of how much forage you have available in your pasture. Another way that you could do it would also be to look at a soil survey, and knowing the location of your property. Soil surveys have included in them an estimate of how much forage should be produced on that soil, on that property, and also has an estimate of the different plant communities that could be growing on that property. And so you can get estimates from that as well. And that's one way to start if you don't have any other method of being able to estimate how much forage you could expect. That's one place that you can look to find some sort of an estimate.
Very good. Thank you for that. If somebody has other questions regarding, range, drought management, those kinds of things, what's the best way to contact you, Keith?
Well, the best way to contact me would be through my K-State email, which is kharmone@ksu.edu, or they could reach me on my cell phone, and that is 785-623-9499. Those are the two best ways to get a hold of me.
All right, Keith, thank you very much for your time and your information. Greatly appreciate it. And we hope everyone has a blessed day.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.